We are at the beginning of one of the most exciting weeks in the spaceflight year 2026.
Artemis 2 is set to be the first manned flight around the moon since Apollo 17 in 1972.
Not a landing yet, but a real human in a system test in deep space. The mission is something like a dress rehearsal for everything that comes after. Orion space capsule, Space Launch System rocket, life support, navigation, communication, and return to Earth.
Artemis 2 has very clear goals and a pretty full schedule.
Only docking with the lunar lander and the landing itself will not be rehearsed. That will happen with Artemis 3. The launch window is open between February 6th and 11th, 2026, with alternative windows in March and April. The earliest planned launch window is February 7th, 2026, early in the morning in Europe. The earliest possible time is 3:41 Central European Time. Of course, I will be streaming here on Mars Chronicles. The actual launch will only be confirmed once all preparations, the so-called wet dress rehearsal and safety tests are completed. During this, the entire launch sequence, including fueling and countdown, is rehearsed up to a few seconds before liftoff. The rocket has already been moved from the Vehicle Assembly Building at Kennedy Space Center to Pad 39B. That's why it's time now for a mission briefing for Artemis 2.
My name is Serwin, and this is Mars Chronicles.
The main payload of the mission is the 4 astronauts, whose main task is to test the Orion spacecraft and all systems under real conditions.
Commander Reed Wiseman. He is an experienced National Aeronautics and Space Administration astronaut and responsible for the mission as a whole. Pilot Victor Glover is also a National Aeronautics and Space Administration astronaut and will support the systems and flight operations.
Mission Specialist Christina Koch holds the record for the longest single mission by a woman in space. She is also an American. Mission Specialist Jeremy Hansen is an astronaut of the Canadian Space Agency, and will be the first non-United States astronaut to participate in a lunar orbit flight.
The crew's Orion spacecraft is named Integrity, symbolizing the commitment to reliability and teamwork on this mission.
Also on board are a few symbolic and technical payloads. These include several small CubeSats and storage devices, among them the so-called Artemis 2 moon tickets. Anyone could register for free and have their name fly along virtually. Now, this data is actually flying around the moon. Technically that's incidental, but symbolically it's pretty powerful. Millions of names going around the moon and back. That's exactly how you connect a test program with the public without turning it into a circus. Artemis 2 is not a landing mission. Instead, it's a systems integration and operational test, similar to the early Apollo missions before humans first set foot on the moon. Specifically, the following is being tested. Life support systems. Do they function reliably over many days in deep space conditions?
Navigation and communication. Can Orion operate continuously without the safety net of Earth orbit?
Radiation safety and health monitoring.
Astronauts will be farther from Earth than on any manned United States mission since 1972.
And Orion's return. The re-entry into Earth's atmosphere and splashdown in the Pacific is a crucial part of mission planning. The mission profile looks roughly like this. Quarantine and preparation. The crew will go into strict quarantine days before launch. All systems will be checked at the last minute.
With them in quarantine are their closest attendants, and the family is also allowed to visit them under strict health checks. In some cases, the families went into quarantine with them.
Meanwhile, training and other preparations continue. Launch and ascent. With the Space Launch System rocket, Orion launches from Kennedy Space Center in Florida and enters Earth orbit. Translunar injection. After a series of orbit adjustments, Orion is sent on a trajectory that will take it around the moon. Lunar flyby free return trajectory. The spacecraft circles the moon at a safe distance without landing. It often uses a free return trajectory that will automatically return it to Earth in an emergency. Return to Earth. After about 10 days in space, Orion heads back and splashes down in the Pacific Ocean. We will go through these steps individually in the next few minutes, with precise technical details, timelines, and what each means for the crew, rocket,
and mission control. When Artemis 2 launches, the mission doesn't begin with a big moon moment, but with something much more mundane, with strict routine. And that's exactly the point. The start shouldn't feel spectacular. It should feel boring, reliable, because anything that goes wrong now goes wrong very early and very visibly. Every mistake could end dramatically and set the program back by years.
A few days before the launch, the crew goes into quarantine. Very traditional. No colds, no risks, no surprises.
At the same time, the Space Launch System rocket is being fueled on the launch pad, the Orion capsule is undergoing final checks, and the ground systems are being powered up.
This is the phase where no new decisions are made. From this point on, only the checklist is followed.
On launch day itself, the crew boards Orion several hours before the actual liftoff. Seats, suits, checks, communication, and the famous mix of routine and tension.
Orion sits on top of the Space Launch System, and the Space Launch System, objectively speaking, is a massive, uncompromising, single-use rocket.
2 solid rocket boosters, a core stage with 4 RS-25 engines.
Everything is optimized to do exactly one thing, to bring as much mass as possible onto an escape trajectory out of Earth orbit.
To really visualize this architecture, I printed an Space Launch System model, or at least started it. I should have it finished by launch. Core stage, boosters, upper stage, Orion on top. You only really understand this rocket as a system when you actually have it physically in front of you. I printed this model on the Prusa Core 1, which is what makes it so interesting. A few years ago, it was unthinkable for an ordinary household to just produce such a demonstration object in a few hours.
Now you can do it in a few clicks. And especially with a rocket like the Space Launch System, you only realize when you see the model how brutally task-specific this thing actually is. Nothing about it is elegant or versatile. It's not a workhorse. It's a golden battering ram.
Technically, that's interesting, because the core stage, with its 4 145 engines, each costing around $145 million, delivers less thrust on the ground than a Falcon 9.
At first, the solid rocket boosters provide the main thrust. However, the core stage burns for over 8 minutes, while a Falcon 9 first stage is done after just over 2.5 minutes.
Of course, these are completely different philosophies for completely different applications. I've linked the printer and the model for you below.
But the real point is, when you look at these systems, you start to understand why Artemis 2 isn't an experiment, but rather a full stress test for an extremely specialized architecture.
The launch itself is brutal, but short. About 8 minutes after liftoff, the core stage is burned out. The solid rocket boosters are long gone by then.
Orion is not yet on its way to the moon at that point, but first in a low Earth orbit, and that's important. Artemis 2 doesn't fly directly to the moon. First, there's a parking orbit around the Earth.
During this phase, the crew checks the spacecraft under real flight conditions. Power supply, navigation, life support, communication, and attitude control. This is Orion's first major endurance test with a crew.
This phase doesn't last forever, but it's long enough to make sure the spacecraft is healthy.
If something fundamental is wrong here, Artemis 2 won't continue its flight.
Then the crew returns. That's what this intermediate phase is for. Only when everything is green does the crucial step of the translunar injection burn, or translunar injection for short, take place.
That's the moment when Orion leaves Earth's orbit.
A targeted engine burn lasting several minutes that increases the speed so much that the capsule no longer falls around the Earth, but instead moves onto a trajectory toward the moon.
From this moment on, there's no just turning around anymore. From here, the mission truly becomes a lunar mission.
What you have to realize is that this isn't a straight flight. Orion is sent on what's called a free return trajectory.
That's a path that's set up so that it circles the moon and automatically brings you back to Earth, even if the main engine fails completely later on. That's old Apollo logic, but it's still brilliant.
Safety via geometry and orbital mechanics. In the hours after the translunar injection, the transition to real deep space operations begins. The Earth slowly gets smaller, and communication no longer runs through the normal low Earth orbit infrastructure, but through the deep space network.
And for the crew, The actual purpose of this mission begins, living and working in a spacecraft that is no longer within reach of a quick rescue plan. From this point on, Artemis 2 is no longer a test flight in the traditional sense. It's a real expedition, just without a landing. After translunar injection and the first days in open space, the flight settles down, at least outwardly. Technically, everything is now ready for long-distance operation. The flyby itself is the emotional highlight of the mission. Orion will come closer to the moon than any manned mission since Apollo 17, except maybe Apollo 8. The exact distance varies depending on the flight profile, but we're talking about just a few thousand kilometers above the surface. The crew no longer sees the moon as a disk, but as a landscape with craters, edges, and shadows.
And then comes the most important point of the entire mission, the flyby behind the moon. As soon as Orion disappears behind the moon, radio contact with Earth is lost.
No relay or direct connection. For a time, the crew is truly alone, which is exactly the intent. They want to test how navigation, scheduling, onboard operations, and crew coordination feel when there is no real-time communication with Earth. This isn't just technology, it's psychology. Apollo astronauts have repeatedly described that the moment when Earth suddenly disappears does something to you mentally. On the far side of the moon, Orion will reach the point of greatest distance from Earth. Humans haven't been farther away since 1972. After that, the geometry of the orbit slowly reverses again. The moon's gravity has done its job. Orion doesn't fall back. It's brought back. The return flight to Earth also takes several days, and that's not idle time either. Now they're testing what will really be needed for Artemis 3.
Long-term operation of the systems, energy management, temperature control, navigation, communication, and crew routines.
This isn't a "we're looking out the window" phase. This is a system test under real conditions. The "we're looking out the window" phase is when the crew flies behind the moon. National Aeronautics and Space Administration has deliberately planned nothing for that time except to observe the lunar surface and let the crew photograph it at their discretion. Shortly before reaching Earth comes the next critical phase, preparing for re-entry. Orion isn't returning from Earth orbit, it's coming from a lunar trajectory. That means significantly higher speeds than with regular International Space Station returnees. The heat shield will be under more stress than anything National Aeronautics and Space Administration has flown since Apollo. That's exactly what they want to test. The procedure is classic. Service module, separation, alignment to the entry angle, then entering the Earth's atmosphere, first plasma, then deceleration, then parachutes, finally splashdown in the Pacific, and recovery by the United States Navy. The problem here is not insignificant. During Artemis the Fern, the capsule skipped over the atmosphere like a stone skipping across the surface of the water. This led to entire pieces of heat shield tiles being blown off in dozens of places, because heat built up under the tiles and caused major and dangerous damage. National Aeronautics and Space Administration has now investigated this problem for 2 years and has decided on the following measure. Skipping over the atmosphere is omitted. Instead, the capsule enters Earth's atmosphere directly. Write in the comments what your gut feeling says about this. This is precisely where this mission comes full circle. Artemis 2 doesn't need to prove humans can reach the moon. That was shown in 1969. This mission is meant to show that we can do it again today as a system, with modern technology, with different structures, with a different approach to risk, but with the same demand for reliability. If this mission goes smoothly, Artemis 3 is still far from a guarantee, but it will become credible. Because then we'll know Orion works, the crew procedures work, the navigation, communication, re-entry. Everything fits together. Artemis 2 isn't a step onto the moon, but a step back to the ability to even fly there again. And that's exactly what will determine whether Artemis becomes more than just a program.
Namely, an infrastructure once again.
I'm Serwin, and that was Mars Chronicles. If this mission briefing helped you, leave a subscription. Write in the comments how your gut feeling is about February 7th. And if you think Artemis 3 will really happen in 2027, thanks for tuning in. Pera spera ad astra.
Bada bing, bada boom.